whether it's something that's founded on marriage or other kind of durable relationships. And basically what they want to do is to create a situation where the old family form, which has served Ireland so well over the centuries through very difficult times, is something you leave behind. And instead what you do is you call into question the normative foundation of the family, and instead you talk about families on the ground that it's more institutional. The Prime Minister of Ireland calls this constitutional catch-up. I love that expression, constitutional catch-up, that the Constitution is finally catching up with the real reality of what a family should be like, rather than something that's been steeped in the past. And I think what's happening in Ireland in this referendum, and I don't know whether it will be passed. I hope the Irish people, I know they've been colonized by the EU very big time, so I really hope they don't go along with this and basically realize how damaging that would be. But nevertheless, what this constitutional amendment does is it captures the dominant zeitgeist in the way that the family is perceived within Western societies, particularly Western Europe. And that's really what I want to talk about. Earlier on, I tried to pose the question, why is it that even though we and I, everyone in this room knows that the family is an important and wonderful institution that we need to flourish as a society, why is it that this family is framed in such a negative way and is perceived as a problem in so many different dimensions of experience? And my short answer to that is that actually it's got to do with culture. And it's got to do with the new cultural framing of what human relationships are all about, or ultimately what a human being is really all about. And therefore, when you have a cultural dynamic that deprives the family of any kind of meaning, any kind of intrinsic meaning, it means that anything that a family does or is associated with family processes will be immediately diagnosed as a problem. So take pregnancy. There used to be a time when pregnancy was seen as a wonderful thing. You give birth to a baby and you kind of hold the baby. Well, in our culture, you basically regard that little baby as a potential threat to the environment, as somebody who is there to consume carbon. And therefore, the baby is no longer seen as this wonderful new thing that has been brought into this world. You give it a much more dark, insidious definition. But it doesn't stop there, because our culture will then go from the baby to the mother. And what our culture has done is it's reinvented pregnancy as a kind of medical threat. So pregnancy becomes the precursor of postpartum depression. And I always remember when this was already in place a while back, when my wife gave birth in England, and we're jumping up and down with joy, and my mother is there, and even though she's very old, she's also jumping up and down. We're all very, very happy. And the midwife comes along, and the first question she asked my wife is, "Are you depressed? Are you depressed?" And I still remember my wife whispering to me, saying, "Fuck off," basically. Are you depressed? When she's so happy with basically what has actually just has happened. So the point I want to make is that everything that's to do with family life, without exception, has got this medicalized diagnosis attached to it, which basically says, beware, this is a health problem. And suddenly, families are seen in a very, very different way. Now, I'm, without doubt, the oldest person in the room. And I still remember when I started teaching in university in the 1970s. And when I started teaching in the university, I still remember that in the sociology, this discipline, we talked about the family in such a way that we were concerned about the many problems facing the family. And we talked about the problem family. And the problem family was, in those days, a family where the husband was absent. A problem family was something where the wife was feeling really overwhelmed and couldn't really be a good mother. A problem family was one that was so poor that they could barely make ends meet. A problem family was one where the children were neglected and they were not looked after. And we knew, as social scientists, that a problem families were a minority, a small minority of all the other families. And all the books that were written was about what should we do? What can we do to improve the world of the problem families? That was in the 1970s. And I remember waking up one morning and going to my lecture to talk about the family and realizing that actually something very important has changed. And what has changed is that in the social sciences, we were no longer talking about the problem families. We were talking about the family as the problem. Right? The family became a problem. And that's a fundamental distinction, happened in a very short period of time. In my lifetime, a fundamental revision has occurred because it meant, whereas in the 1970s, social workers were committed to keeping families together, they were trying to keep the family together because they knew that was important for the child. By the time you got to the late 1980s, they were much more concerned with saving the child from the parents. And the job was no longer keeping the family. And I still remember debating a professor of social work in New York. And I made the point about how important it was to keep the family together. And he says to me, you don't understand. An unhappy family is bad for the child. I don't know if you ever heard that expression. If the family is unhappy, it's better to get divorced. It's better if the family is kind of broken up. And I said, actually, when the child grows up and realizes that the family has been broken up because mom and dad were unhappy, they're not going to say, oh yeah, I'll give you a standing ovation. You made the right decision. They're going to resent very much the fact that you put your so-called happiness in front of the well-being of the children. And when I said that, I was expecting a big applause. Frank is very smart, very intelligent. Yeah, I got no applause. This was America. This was New York. And instead, people looked at me as if I was Dracula. Sort of somehow, where did this guy kind of come from? And that's what happened within the social sciences. So a big change has occurred. And by the 1990s, you began to use the expression called the dark side of the family. And the dark side of the family basically meant that behind closed doors, within the family, what was going on wasn't loving care and nourishment and flourishing. Behind the closed door, you had violence, you had wives being beaten up by husbands, you had children being abused by all kinds of people, and essentially, there was this total mistrust of the family, the capacity of the family to produce a healthy life for young people. And as that occurs, that's really when you begin to have the scientization of family life. Earlier on, somebody asked the question, can you give an illustration of the way that science has been misused? I can give you hundreds of illustrations from the way that neuroscience has been harnessed to demonstrate that parents are responsible for the problems to do with the neurotic sort of way that the brain works, all the way to a number of different things. But the most important thing that I learned is that there is no such thing as a science of the family. Right? That's the important thing to learn. Why? Because of all the problems facing society, you will find that every single piece of research on the family is based upon the subjective experience of the author. Family research is compromised by the fact that everybody thinks they know what a family is, because they all live in one, but because they are talking about their subjective experiences, it becomes a very arbitrary, a very sort of almost ideological sort of science that we have as a result of that. So I learned to mistrust this, the science of the family for that reason. And I learned that over the years, almost everything that people say about the family is either one-sided or completely wrong. So I'll give you one example. And this is something that even a lot of conservatives unquestioningly sort of repeat. There seems to be this mantra, And the mantra is that the reason why the family is in trouble today is because of economic change or socioeconomic development, that somehow there is some objective social economic process, whether it's hyper-consumerism or neoliberalism or a variety of individuation, all these different things happening outside of the family are responsible for the problems that we face. This is what I call socioeconomic determinism. And the determinism is actually stronger than Marxist kind of determinism because it involves more causal factors in relation to that. So, for example, one of the things that's blamed upon the socioeconomic factors on the family is the changing position of women. The argument is that as you have women having a new position, as more women go out to work, the family is undermined. The children are no longer looked after, and indeed we have less children than ever before. Not true. Not true. To give you an example, if you look at statistics, it will show you that throughout the 20th century, whenever there was large, intense levels of poverty, when they were expecting birth rates to fall, for example, in the 1930s depression, when there was large levels of unemployment, instead of birth rates falling, it's actually increased by a little bit. Why? Because when you're really poor, when you have economic struggle, then you rely on the family more than ever before. It's at that point that you really realize the importance of solidarity at that basic fundamental level. Take the example of Hungary, which again I think is paradigmatic in this respect. In Stalinist Hungary, it was a horrible period, I know because I was a child. In Stalinist Hungary, with all the terror and all the terrible atmosphere that occurred, in 1954, I was 7 years old, wasn't old enough to be a father at that point. In 1954, the fertility rate was 2.97, 2.97 per family in that time. That's 1954, a really bad period, economic struggling. This year, right, 2023, when living standards are much, much higher than they were in 1954, the fertility rate is just barely over 1.5. And it's gone up a little bit because of the government's policy over what it was beforehand, but it's 1.5 in an economic situation, in a climate where living standards are much better. So why is it that in this terrible era of the 1950s, Hungarian women and Hungarian families had a higher birth rate than is the case now? The reason for that, I think, is because in that particular moment, the cultural drivers against family, the cultural pressures against family did not exist, were much weaker. And I remember in the Stalinist era, we talked about things that, oh yeah, look at Marika over there. She's not a great mother. And somebody would say that, oh, that husband drinks too much. And you'd kind of make that kind of note. But that was never an issue about the family. It had to do with the fact that certain parents didn't step up. And in 1954, you didn't have teenagers going around saying, oh, I'm not going to be a mother or I'm not going to be a father when I grow up because of global warming or some sort of fantasy like that. I'm not saying it's entirely fantasy, but if you know what I mean. So that's the way that the whole situation works. And the other thing that you have to remember is that in the 1954, the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, under Stalinist governments, the work rate of women, women who went out to work, was actually higher than now, right? So women are going out to work. In 1987, before regime change, 80% of Hungarian women had a job outside of the home, okay? That's a very high rate. And yet, their fertility rate was much, much higher than it is now when there are less women going out to work. So the point I want to emphasize is there is no causal connection. There's no causal connection between economic and social factors or the nature of social and economic change, and what happens to the family. What happens to the family is entirely dependent upon whether we give family life meaning. It's all about meaning. Do people within a family find that experience meaningful, something that they feel touches their soul, makes them feel human, or is the family something that lacks meaning for them? Because for some reason or another, when they look around to the mother, father, and their brothers and sisters, the bonds, those powerful bonds that connect us in our private lives have been ruptured, have become weaker. And I suggest it's the tragedy is that when those bonds are ruptured, when you become disconnected from each other and from generations beforehand, then the meaning that you attach to the relationships that you have become much, much weaker. And there are many, many reasons as to why that is, why the meaning that people gain from family life has become weaker. And very often, we overlook those. You have to remember that Western culture in particular is one that particularly emphasizes California values. If you look at California values and the way they project what is good and what is bad, the way they idealize who's a nice, sensitive person, who's a role model, and who isn't, it becomes fairly evident that the culture that they project is entirely hostile to the family. I mean, how many films have you seen recently? How many Netflix series have you seen recently where the family is presented and portrayed in a positive way? How many films have you seen where the husband and the mother and the children are loving each other? They're kissing each other, and you have the blue skies and the sun, sort of in a kind of idealized way. You don't see that. What you see instead is something very, very different, where family becomes a site of brutalization, and the family becomes a place where all the relationships are ruptured, or basically become disconnected from one another. And when you have that kind of cultural pressure, something very important happens. And what happens is what Hannah Arendt, who's my favorite political philosopher, described as the colonization of people's life world, where increasingly, because the family is portrayed as this dark place, there's an incentive on the part of experts, professionals, on the part of the governments and officialdom and bureaucracy to make up for the parental family deficits. And what you see decade by decade by decade is the family becomes a site, a landscape that you invade, where people put their nose into what goes on within the family, to the point at which you actually make it very difficult for families to flourish and to develop their life and their kind of life world. And it seems to me that the most destructive side of this, something I feel very strongly about, is that when you begin to see the family in that sense, when generations are estranged from one another, you begin to call into question what I call in my essay adult authority. Adult authority, which is the foundation on which societies have been built on for many, many centuries, all of a sudden is seen as being a problem rather than a solution. Adults are seen as being insensitive grown-ups. Again, think of a Netflix series. In every Netflix film, the adults are stupid and insensitive, and the children are the ones that know more than mom and dad. Right? I don't know if you've seen, for example, the Home Alone films. That's a very good example, where the kids are the really agile, flexible, smart ones, and the parents are just a bunch of deadbeats. That kind of representation, generational relationship, basically leads to a situation where you have a reversal, what I call in my book, socialization in reverse, when the children are given the task of socializing their parents rather than the other way around. And you've noticed this. For example, I remember when my son used to come home and say, "Oh, Dad, my teacher said that I should teach you to recycle." Or, "Oh, Dad, my teacher said that it's very, very important that you and Mom sort of talk to each other in a pleasant and polite way." Or "Dad, I heard, my teacher said that I heard that you swear sometimes." All I could say, it's not sometimes, it's very frequently. But the whole idea was that somehow my son should be the one that teaches me life lessons, and what I'm teaching him, sort of is the opposite. So we ended up with basic tactics, and this is the one advice I give to anybody. I wrote a book on parenting, and I said, ignore the experts. My only advice about parenting is that when your child comes home with all the idiotic things about sexuality and about transgender ideology and everything else, or about the environment being, finished tomorrow, what I used to say, and my wife used to say, very simple, this is what they say. I'm using the word they as like an alien element. This is what they say. This is what the Furedis think. And this would be something we would repeat time and time again. This is what they say. This is what the Furedis think. Because that's the only way you can protect your child from all the corrosive, negative influences that are there. So the point I'm making is that when you have this process of socialization in reverse, what you do is create this double process, which I call the infantilization of adults and the adultification of children. Right? That dynamic of adultifying kids through, for example, children's rights, which is one of those silly concepts because children cannot have rights that mean anything. They're not right-bearing individuals. The only people that can make sure that their rights are respected are professional experts who make a living out of speaking up for the child. When you have children's rights being institutionalized, what it does, it basically is not give children more power, but it disempowers adults. It makes the work of adults much, much weaker. So what I want to argue is this. The first step towards the reconstitution of proper family life is in a sense, creating a renaissance for adult authority. It depends on adults behaving like adults rather than as weak, fragile individuals. So we've got to give adults more strength to be able to take responsibility for the younger generations. We've got to get across the idea that you, as an adult, are not just responsible for your own children, you're responsible for the whole generation of young people. That is really important that we kind of affirm, because we now have a situation where adults don't interfere or don't help children who are not their own. They somehow think that's not my business. It is your business. Adults need to be able to take responsibility, regardless of whether or not you have a child. That is your responsibility. And we need to basically create a situation where that adult authority, which is the most important precondition, and has been for family life and for reproduction of our society, is something that we fight for relentlessly. Because to me, the issue at stake here about families is so important that it essentially raises questions about human civilization, about Western civilization. Because the attacks on the family today are fundamentally anti-civilizational. They are basically challenging all the civilizational gains that we developed about how we treat each other as human beings. So what I want to suggest is that we got to understand that the problem is culture. We got to engage in a culture war against the anti-family sort of pressures that are bearing down upon us. And we have to understand that the only way that we can step up and win this war and save the next few generations from being influenced by it is if we take culture more seriously and become brave and angry and open our voices rather than just keep quiet. You know, earlier on people were saying that parents, I think, Rob, you were saying that a parent can intervene in school and tell the teachers or something that you heard something and fight against back that. But you know, a lot of parents have no idea what their children are learning. In Scotland, the parents have no right to know what kind of sex education the children are getting. I've talked to mothers who've gone to school and said, I want to know what the sex curriculum is. And the teachers and the principals said that we cannot give you that because it's a copyright issue. The people that give us the book have a copyright over it, and we cannot tell you what it is. So they're basically indoctrinating our children behind our back, and most parents have got no idea until it's too late. So we want to be in a position where, at the very least, we can alert parents, alert the people of Europe about what's happening behind their backs, and not and create a situation where we can mobilize a rebellion, a revolt of parents against all the bad stuff that kids are being socialized into. Thank you.
Thank you, great. So now, Ladislav, it would be your turn. I suggest if you keep it relatively short so we can open to the floor for questions and comments, because I think the key is, as Frank said, that we are all involved. It's not a matter of specialists, intellectuals. We all have a role to play. So.
Yeah, thank you. So first I will reflect on this change on Irish constitution. So actually it opens the basic question, is families just one of the same, the different types of lifestyle, or it is something special? And I would move that to the football playground. So for example, Croatian football team is quite good, as you know, and we could treat every player the same, you know, according to this rule of equality, you know. So it means that I should pass the same number of balls to all players. But then since we have this Luka Modric, I don't know if you know about him, you know, so it's very clever to pass him the ball, you know, because he delivers results. So if you are result-oriented, then you will recognize that family is something special, and not to have this ideological equality, or I don't know what approach, with this story of discrimination, you know, like I was supposed to go to jail for 18 months because I positively spoke about marriage, and then some left-wing NGOs filed a lawsuit against me because they said that on that way I discriminate homosexual and out marriage couples. So that is this, you know, discrimination as a bulldozer who wants to ruin every differences in society, which is not result-oriented by this ideology. And now, why I think the family is important, why I think that a family delivers results. I will use one picture, and this is a picture of, let's say, 1-year-old daughter or son who hugs her or his mother or father. And I certainly don't want to use some emotional or romantic influence. I really want to put it really on rational basis. What I can see there, that this child is completely addicted to its parent. Completely addicted. So when you see that this child needs your love, you give this love. You know, you will feed them, you will put him to bed, you will wake up during night for 10 times, you will do whatever it is needed to be done. Because you feel that this love is needed. And there are really a bunch of amazing things what a parent can do for his child. So nobody could even imagine that you can do it, you know. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing, by doing this, you deliver results. You do something good for the other. You do something for society, let's say so. And that's why we have, you know, who can educate children better than their parents? Who will do it with more love than parents? Why we have so many in business of many family companies, because you feel trust among each other, what is evident, needed in business sector, that you have trust between partners in business, yeah. Or why we have more children in marriages and so on. But one another thing, by doing this, but by giving this love, you increase your capability to love. So in these days, we don't speak about capability to love. We think that capability of love is always the same. It is not. It is like in sport. If you live like a single person, I have nothing against single person, and of course we have to make the difference between people who live in a single, because they want to have to get married and to have family, but still didn't find something and so on. Or people who, by intention, live alone. And then you make your life, you arrange your life according to your needs so that you don't have to move and so on. So it's like in sport. If you don't move for 1 day, for 2 days and so on, your condition will decrease. And that's the problem of today's society, that we decreased the level of our capability to love. And one more thing, I usually don't make any performance, but I will do it. You know, so if you think that this is, let's say, nail, this is nail, and now since it is a pluralistic society, I can use some examples from Christianity. And Christianity is based on the idea of love. So when they asked Jesus, what is the greatest command? He said it is love. Love to God and love to your neighbors. And everything hangs, not depend, but hangs. You know, like you have a nail and you put everything on this nail, you know. And this nail is love. And if this nail do something, everything will fail. So everything, all science, everything what we spoke, philosophy, psychology, relations, equality, I don't know what. Everything depends on this love, on this nail of love. And this love today is really bad. And that's the reason why we have problems in our society. So this is, and really, I don't think that emotionally, I don't make this romantic story out of this. This is a crucial point of everything, of our families, our society. And now, what I would like to reflect, just this in my introduction, about the first panel and my question about sexuality. I will use now the possibility to say what I think. Yes, sexuality, I think it is the strongest factor to ruin love, to ruin our capability to love. Because our sexuality is made so that we are men and women. So we attract each other. And when you attract each other, then it means that you have to give love. And it makes joy. You know, not just to receive love from your girlfriend or from your wife. But when you feel that your wife needs love, and then you can provide, that you can give this love. That's what Frank said, that you feel this sense of meaning of life. And then now this sexuality, which is so good, how they say, established, created in us as people, is misused. Why? Because we always, they have these posters with women's body, you know, like an object. We have pornography. We have the ways of life, which it's supposed that you live with your girlfriend, you know, to use this attraction. But, you know, pornography, one man said that the problem of pornography is not that it shows too much, but it shows too little. Because it doesn't show any other aspect of our sexuality, just physical. Where are the emotions? Where are attitudes? Where is our spiritual aspect? Where is our social aspects? And everything. So now our children, treated by these wrong ways of sexual education, of this complete crazy gender ideology in which they made one step more, in which they wanted to be God, to say, sacrifice, we don't want sacrifice. Just the question is, how do you feel? So it's so stupid, since I deal with sexual education for 28 years. So we had this program who was some kind of opposite to us, and they were based on that question, that the basic question for your any sexual behavior should be, how do you feel? You have to see how do you feel. And then since I deal with young people, you know, I dealt with 17 years old for 13 years, now I deal with 14 years old for 10 years. When you come to one man who is, I don't know, young man, 17 years old, and then he is so hot, he would like to have sexual intercourse, you know. And then you feel, how do you feel? Well, so yes, I feel yes, you know. So no attitudes, no brain, no nothing, you know. So it is so stupid as approach. So sexuality is misused to move our attention for love to pleasure. And if we don't fight against this sexuality, then I don't know that we can win this fight. So I think that sexuality, you spoke a lot about individualism, and I completely agree. I would add technology in this and so on. But yes, we have to fight to release love, and then we can and family is the most possible environment to teach love. And one more thing, just so children, when they felt what Margarita has said, when they felt that they are loved, then they will much more easily love in the future. So that is the basic. So that is what we have to do.
Thank you. Frank, before I open to the floor for questions, would you like to make any remarks, especially on the meaning of love, and also how it's missing from this push for the sexual education and also superficial way of seeing the human relations?
Well, I think that the only point I would make is that in the English language, there's a difference between sex and sexuality, because sex refers to, you know, reproduction, to have physical, biological relationship with one another. And sexuality actually is about identity. Right? Your sexuality, when they say, what is your sexuality? What they are saying, because when somebody says, what is my sexuality? You know, they're saying, I'm not sure if you're heterosexual, because you could be something else. When they teach children what they call sexuality studies, or they call it comprehensive sexuality studies, what they're teaching them at a very early age is that your biological sex does not determine your gender, and you may well become something very different. So I think we got to, in a sense, demystify the way that sexuality is used amongst young people as a way of encouraging them to question, you know, who they are. Because your job and my job is to help kids discover who they are, to encourage them to find their identity. Whereas what sexuality promoters do is to confuse children and to make it difficult for them to actually learn what their identity is and who they really are.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Oh, excellent. Here, first one, and then second. Competition with the microphones.
Thank you. So I just wanted to connect to this sexuality thing. So what do you think about the growing rate of asexuality? Do you think it's actual asexuality, or do you think it's just people being oversaturated and turning away from sex? And my second question to that, would it help society or would it completely alienate people from each other?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the second question, please.
Thank you. I would like to ask, how can we help from, I mean, I'm working as an editor-in-chief and as professor. So from the academic viewpoint and from the communication viewpoint, how can we help society to recover meaningful family life?
Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Yes.
I wanted to make a comment about authority. Just to piggyback on the previous discussion, I think that how did it happen that all this nonsense permeated the education system, and there is now sexual education, which was part of biology class, and how did parents not wake up to this? How this has to do, I think, also with the erosion of authority, because the upbringing of children has to do with setting boundaries. Boundaries are set by parents and by the schooling system. But at the end of the day, the sexual education the children receive now is all about destroying these boundaries so that our children and also the adults around them become tolerant of everything. So there are no boundaries. That way we are, in inverted commas, sensitive, non-discriminatory, non-judgmental, blurring the boundary between right and wrong, between normal and crazy. Yeah, I know, then somebody's going to come up and say, but normal is relative, and you know, all this relativism debate. Well, no, we know what normal is, and we know what right is and what wrong is. So I would like Professor Furedi to if he would have some thoughts in this. And also I wanted to mention the change of language. They are changing the language. For example, in the States, there is already a lobby that is trying to normalize and to legalize pedophilia. So pedophiles are now called minor attracted adults, just to make it more palatable to the public.
Mm-hmm. Right, so maybe straight the question for Professor. And then I wanted to ask you, Ladislav, about how we can help society to recover meaningful families, because I think that you might be a good expert on that.
Well, on the asexual thing, I think that there is no such thing as asexual. Whenever I didn't have any girlfriends, I called myself asexual for that week. I think the only asexual things are worms, you know, sort of, and things like that. I think it's one of those invented categories. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I haven't got time to go into this, but every problem that we discuss stems from the crisis of authority. And the crisis of authority in Western civilization kicked in the Reformation, when basically Luther said that your inner conscience, you know, sort of gives you the kind of freedom, you know, it kind of separates you from external constraints, and that basically called into question the authority, religious authority. And ever since then, we've been struggling to find an alternative to religious authority, and that was, you know, we talked about the authority of science, the authority of the law, the authority of popular sovereignty, but that's been a struggle, and it seems to me it's a breakdown of authority, which basically means that in the 21st century, every boundary, every civilizational boundary that I know of has been called into question. So the boundary between children and adults is eroded. The boundary between men and women is called into question. The boundary between private and public is also called into question. You talked about non-judgmentalism. The boundary between right and wrong and good and evil has now been called into question. And now we come to the final frontier. And unless we win, 10 years from now, when we're sitting here, we're going to be discussing why is it that the boundary between humans and animals has been called into question. It's not funny, because now if you insist that there's a moral distinction between humans and animals, they call you a speciesist, which is like a homo. And they're serious. They're homo, you know, they call you a homo, like a speciesist, is better as a homophobe or racist. So I cannot think of any civilizational gain that has come about that hasn't been called into question. And it's all been driven by the same force, and it's enveloped the family in a very kind of powerful way, which basically means that the authority of the parent, which is so essential for human civilization, is now seen as being bad, negative, authoritarian. In fact, in the English language, we invented a word called authoritarian, and everybody thinks that authority and authoritarian is the same thing, not realizing that it's, you know, authority is not authoritarian, because when you have authority, it means you don't have to force people to do something, because the minute you force people to do something, you lost your authority, right? Power and authority are very, very different, and I think this is a very important lesson for us, and in many ways it relates to the point that Ladislav was making in relation to the Christian notion of love, and the way in which that was kind of projected throughout the centuries. Because when you call into question that kind of theological authority as well, then obviously then love then becomes a free floating phenomenon that floats around and is no longer connected to any human relationship or any human boundary. Love becomes, leads to what you call a minority attracted adult. That's the perverted end of that kind of phenomenon.
Mm. Ladislav, on...
If I can just first about asexuality, it is very dangerous. So it is in this sexual education programs, they even have some exercises, in which some pupils have to see, like show how they change partners. And those who don't have sexual intercourse, who are not sexually active, they call them asexual. What is humiliation first. Then it is, I have to use this word again, stupid. Because first, our sexuality is not just our body, but our emotions and everything, identity, what Frank said. So it means that they want to make out of our sexuality just one part of this, ignoring all other parts. And secondly, concerning the time frame, it means that we all who are now in this hall are asexual. Because in this very moment we don't have sexual intercourse. Sorry for being that open, but this is stupid. It is also the same with these abstination programs. Abstination. We all abstain now. So it's just a question if we shall abstain, a month or we shall wait until serious or to marriage or I don't know what. So it is, it is completely logically stupid. Then about authorities, so it's in Croatia, when I was a child, we were in Yugoslavia, and then we had this, in school, indoctrination, yes. But, just as Frank has said, my parents say, okay, they in school will tell you this and this, but, it is not the truth. And of course, I believed my parents and not there. So I think that, of course, today we have much more perfidious, how you say? Perfidious ways of indoctrination and via social media and so on. But finally, there will be more and more wounded souls because of this. But finally, you cannot hide the truth about love. Love is something like, let's say, a disease, which can be transmitted very easily. You can recognize, you will never have a love scene in a movie in which he will tell her, I will love you in the next 3 months, usually, always he will say, I will love you forever. So you cannot change the basic things of love, that love itself wants to last, and then love itself wants to give and to receive. So it's so natural and so strong that you cannot hide that. But you can hide a little bit so that you make some pattern of life that people don't discover this love. That's the problem. And that we are here to move these barriers so that they can recognize love much before then they would do it now.
On that, I actually had this thought that actually why they're so pervasive with their messaging and Netflix and so on is that they use the words that have got meaning, but they devalue them of the meaning. So now love, if you talk about love, it's either this very superficial romantic image that is not realistic at all, and it's this kind of initial falling in love and the chemicals shooting and so on and so forth, or that it's not related to this kind of responsibility, having deeper meaning, longer term commitment and so forth. So they devalue that and they promoted that this is really the love, the one without the value. So I think that's what...
The lady also mentioned this language, manipulation, with which in European Parliament we don't have any more prostitution, we have sex work. And so that is dangerous. But still, I think that we can do a lot if we connect people on this basis of common sense. And because, they, if I can use this expression, they have no limits. So they will, as they say, as we say, will have boiled the frog too fast. You know, so they think when you jump into their committees, they feel so encouraged to say all these stupidities, believing really that it is the truth. And going more ambitious and more ambitious, this is the Greens' expression, more ambitious and more ambitious. And then finally they come to the point that it is more than obvious that they made mistakes. So I think that it is just the question, a lot of people are firstly confused. So, and they cannot understand everything what we say, and we will never have the opportunity to say all of what we have said today to all people. But we have to move these barriers.
Can I just say one thing about Patricia's point, which was how do we react to this? I think the battle will be won and lost with children and schools. I think a very good example of how you fight back was in Virginia last year, where the parents rebelled when they discovered what they were, this was in COVID, they heard on Zoom the stupid things that teachers were teaching them. For the first time, they discovered that, and they organized a rebellion. And I think we need to mobilize parents and make them aware of what's really happening. Because as a parent, you don't care about the culture wars in general, but you do care about your child. And you want to make your child doesn't become indoctrinated in that way. And I think that's the first step in our reaction, the first effective step in our reaction to the opposition.
And then probably also making sure that whichever organization of parents in whichever European country has made already some gains or experience in how to fight back, that they share this. Because I find it quite valuable when it comes to freedom of speech, that when we unite and we help each other with ideas how to fight back, then it makes it more effective. So I think, as with our conference here tonight, that it helps connecting and learning from each other. Any more questions? Yes, here, gentleman.
Thank you. Herman Kelly, Irish Freedom Party, Would You Believe in Ireland? I'll just give you a bit more information about and then ask a question about. So this referendum in Ireland, which has just been announced yesterday, is very revealing, I think, about what you may call fourth wave feminism. And that it is very odd, wouldn't you think, that self-declared feminists, their part in this is for the government are seeking to remove the word woman and mother in the only place that they exist in the Irish Constitution. They also want to remove from this Article 41.2, also want to remove the word home for some reason. And it kind of resonates with me, the whole thing of feminism has moved from an idea of man and woman being complementary to now being completely interchangeable, and that now we're exactly the same. But the removal of the words woman and mother really does show the move towards this, let's say, the erasure of woman and the rejection of biology and the move towards gender ideology, which Ladislav mentioned there is a very dangerous ideology, especially when it comes to children as well. And the second point that the referendum wants to change is just a few years ago in Ireland, they had a referendum to introduce that homosexuals could get so-called married in Ireland. Now they're looking to remove in the Irish Constitution the part where it says, that the family based on marriage. So now they're looking to remove this based on marriage part, that it's basically open to a man and his dog. Well, that's an exaggeration, but in theory, this whole thing, if you remove the family based on marriage, it's whatever you want yourself, be it well, I'm not a great expert in the pronunciation of some of these words, polyamory, and all these different ones like that.
Polyamorous.
Obviously, I don't use it very often, so that's good. So just on the one point about, let's say, well, no country has a future without children. And do you think this visible rejection of heterosexual relations, heteronormativity, that it's open to whatever you want yourself, that obviously when you break down the family, faith, family, fecundity often go together. With this gender ideology, there's less biologically based sexual relations between men and women, there's less children in general, and the nation and the nation state which flow from that decreases. Do you think that there's something about not only hatred of your body and the biology of it, but also of your nation as well? Because if you're looking to destroy the number of children, you're also looking to destroy the future of your country. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that overnight.
And more questions, comments? Yes, Arte? Okay.
Thank you for the presentation and for the reply. One of the interesting things about MCC Brussels is that we think a lot about language and the way that the language keeps getting co-opted. And Frank mentioned authority versus authoritarian, sex versus sexuality, and in the gentleman's remark as well, there seems to be very easily the kind of a war on motherhood, which mothers are now called pregnant people, so that anyone can apparently now become mothers. So that was a comment, but the question that I have specifically is about what Frank brought up about, which I really like, about the infantilization of adults and adultification of children, which you described the process as to how that happens. And one of the things that strikes me is sort of, what about the psychology, let's say, of equality, breaking the lines and breaking the boundaries between different categories? And it seems like the more this panel or this conversation went on, we saw that much more. Like, we don't see even the difference between the animal and the human. We don't see the difference between man and woman. So there seems to be a drive which just tends to equalize everything together, and I wanted to see sort of what you think about that as another
Thank you.
part of this.
Jacob, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Let's take this one. Yes, thank you so much. From the back, it's me asking the question. So I remember how my grandfather taught me how to ride the bike. He attached the body, the stick of a broom, to the body of the bike. And at some point, when he felt confident that I can go on my own, he let go of the broom. And I didn't even realize, but I was riding the bike alone. And isn't it also an obstacle on the way we raise children, this fear-driven society that we're creating? Because I am fairly young. I am part of the civilization that we often criticize for its relationship towards values. But isn't it related to embedded fear in parents as well, that don't let go of your children? I mean, I've just looked up the data on what age generally kids leave their parents' home. The results are shocking if you check Italy, Spain, or other Western socialist governments. You can see that maybe kids are even 30 or above when they leave the family home. So what's the relation on this fear-driven society on the way we raise children?
Thank you. Jacob?
Yeah, well, similar vein in a way, but I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that I'm now at the age where lots of my friends who have had relationships for a while, and if they've had relationships for a while, children are coming along, and it's kind of like that time of my life. And I noticed that those kind of things happen relatively organically, relatively naturally. And I wonder if, to talk about the family in crisis, we're kind of almost too late. Because I think there's a relatively decent and reliable data as well, that the problem is not necessarily with people who are in relationships not having children, although that is a problem. But there's an even bigger problem with people not getting into relationships at all, people not getting married in the first place, people not spending time together. And so I wonder if we need to think a little bit about what comes before the family. Why is it that the family itself holds a little attraction for people? Why do they not form them? Why do people not want to get into relationships? And there's it's well-trodden path now to look at the kind of, on both
youngish women and youngish men kind of bemoaning the state of their life, that it's like really hard to find a partner, and men are like, oh, everyone's on Tinder and it's impossible and blah, blah. And there's this kind of like self kind of pity, self-hatred that goes along with it. And I think that challenging the tremendous lack of confidence that young people feel in terms of their future, in terms of what family life or relationships might hold for them, that's the kind of key that unlocks the whole process and gets it going.
Mm-hmm. Frank, would you like to reply on the fear-driven society? And
yeah, I mean, I wrote a book. The only time I wrote a book that was a bestseller, it's called Paranoid Parenting, and it's available in different languages. And the Paranoid Parenting book explains why it is that parents are scared to let their children walk to school by themselves. You know, why it is that every childhood experience comes with a health warning. You know, why in America, you know, you have all these medical diagnoses. I mean, we take it for granted there's a mental health crisis among children. I think that's questionable. That's basically to do with the medicalization of childhood. And my argument is the reason why this occurs has got to do with what I mentioned earlier on, the colonization of the life world of the private sphere. Because when experts and social engineers intrude into the family, they basically turn a family from being a relationship, because that's what a family is, a relationship, to, and parenting has got to do with a relationship. So parenting is no longer about relationships, but they use this word that's been invented, also a new word called parenting skill. I don't know if you heard of a parenting skill. It's a weird word, right? It's like, you know, I can see a carpenter having a skill, right, or a surgeon having it, but the parenting skill renders technical what is a moral relationship. Mm-hmm. The minute you do that, then parents become, they lose control, right? They lose control and they become really scared you know, about their kids. And I think that this development is really very, very important. And it also touches on what Jacob said about human relationships, because what this leads to is awareness, not just for your child, but of other people. In sociology, we have a term that I love, and it's called cultural cooling. And what cultural cooling means is that we psychically distance people from each other. So we don't only have less children, we have less close friends, right? And as we have less close friends, we have less organic ties to a community. And what cultural cooling does is it basically means that, for example, people my son's age have less sexual relationships than my generation did. They have less, they date less, physically date less. They're much more likely to find a date online dating, replacing, you know, what we used to do. You go to a bar and you meet somebody. You know, that kind of physical eye contact, you know, which gives you signals, is now no longer possible because it could be harassment, it could be, you know, lack of consent. So when you have cultural cooling like this, it does lead to what you're describing, and it's very much linked to the colonization of our life world, where technicians and bureaucrats and policymakers believe that they're doing a lot of good by disempowering people from our relationships. And it also leads to what Ashley was saying, which is we render formal informal relationships, because a human relationship is spontaneous. When you talk about love and loving forever, you're not speaking to a script. There's something that moves you in a particular kind of direction. You cannot even give it a word. But when you have a situation where relationships become seen as transactional, where you have to gain consent before you make the next move, where you're worried about eye contact as being misunderstood, under those circumstances, then the very act of that spontaneity, which is really the joyous dimension of relationship, is pushed out, and it becomes increasingly formal. So the extreme example of that is when you have a contract in America. You know, when you have on campuses sex with somebody, you have, you know, hello, can I now kiss you on the ear and take it? Can I now move on? And and it's and you can imagine, you know, I mean, the desire just, in my case, would die if you had to make those kind of ticks all the time. But that's, you know, what happens under those circumstances. It becomes like a business arrangement, and that is cultural cooling in its extreme form.
Can I add just something about fear? The question is fear of what? Fear of injuries or something like this, you know, I would blame also parents who are overprotected, you know. So they, my child this and this, you know, and this is also something what you practice. For example, we have 6 children. I can tell you from example with what they say about sterilization of the bottle, you know. So this is what you do with for your first child by boiling, and for the fourth with blowing away, you know. So it's enough, you know. So your capability to laugh increases, you know, by time. So you are not that afraid. And this fear of health, what we could recognize during COVID, what was the I don't know, the primary value of the mankind? It is so stupid. I'm not afraid of being sick, but I think that that people have fear of sacrifice. That's the problem. They fear that they have to sacrifice for something. And this is what we have to change. And one thing more about this polyamoria and everything what can be arranged by states. One thing what also has to be changed, sorry, I really think that our opponents made these changes very carefully on lots of layers, so it's not easy to give the answer, you know, like we have to do this or that. But the question of human rights, you know, so it's, I think that it is more than obvious that also institutions have some rights. Like, for example, Music Academy has the right to refuse you because you don't have, how to say, here, you don't sing well, you know. So otherwise, or I don't know, school for pilots can refuse you or me because I don't see good enough. So if I'm the pilot, people could be killed in the airplane. So it is obvious that institutions have some rights. But what is the hierarchy between personal rights, which are very underlined in these times, and rights of institutions? You know, so if we say that the right of Music Academy to refuse you is more important than your wish, and today we have all our wishes are suddenly human rights. It is not just my wish, it is my human right. I want to make abortion. No, it's my human right to make abortion. It is my human right to change sex. It is everything is human, basic human rights, you know. So it is that in the European Parliament. So I think that we have to underline that civilizations mean that we have cultivated relations in institutions. And then sometimes rights of institutions like marriage is an institution, are more important than our human rights, actually human wishes. So that's why I think that we have to prevent the institution of marriage and institution of a family.
Mm-hmm. We just have a few minutes left, and so I think I will use my privilege of being a chair and being here and just challenging you with a comment, question, for the final remarks, and first for Ladislav and then for Frank. I see a tension between what elites are promoting and actively pushing through, whether with legislation or popular culture. So this that children are bad for environment, different ideologies that question the basics of biology, and so on and so forth. But then on the other hand, we have the huge migration into Europe, where the population is from majority Muslim background countries, where the traditional values are very strong, the family structure is very strong, the connections, the bonds that also expand into whether clan or particular ethnic group. And they not touched so strongly by this ideology, by the push from the authorities, because also we see in Britain a Christian woman being arrested for silently praying in her head in front of abortion clinic. but then there is a public display of a Muslim prayer in front of Downing Street, and no one gets arrested, nothing happens. We can say it's almost celebrated. So I wanted to challenge first you, Ladislav, and then Frank, about this tension, and how do you see then? Would you have an attempt at understanding whether this is normal, or why do you think this is possible, actually, that we have this kind of double standard, but also how would it play out into the future?
It is the part of this manipulation. Boris Havel, one of the best professors in Croatia concerning migration, said that you cannot have one person with strong identity, you know, like, let's say, Muslim from Morocco who is very proud to be Sunni, very proud to be from this tribe, very proud to be man from this family and so on, to be integrated in a society who doesn't even know which sex they are, you know, like, sorry for, sometimes we from the East can be rude for you from the West, but sometimes we don't know really if, for example, Swedish people know which sex they are, and they expect that these people with strong identity will implement in this non-existing identity, what is not very, very logical. But finally, I think that I'm optimist. Optimist since I have to say that I'm a believer, I'm Christian, and for me, things are actually very simple. I really believe that Jesus already saved the world 2,000 years ago. He gave us free will. I don't know why. I think that he really...
For free.
For free. He really loves us. And so I don't understand that completely, but okay. So we make mistakes. And people make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And certainly this is a very nice part of the world. Tomorrow in 100 years, 200 years, there will be some people who will live here. And I'm sure that we shall win, so Christianity will win. So there were civilizations who went up and down and so on, but Christianity will prevail finally. You know, so that is what I think. But what we really have to do, and why we are hard workers, as you said, because I really think that we have to share this love to other people. And final remark will be that after New Year, we shall start one European citizen initiative on gender issue, on sex change. And I think that we can get the biggest possible and the biggest network ever in the European Union and wider. What I think that it is very important to stand up to show that we exist. I think that even the left-wing voters will support this, you know, because I have friends from the left who say, okay, this abortion and so, but my children, if they would say, I want to change sex, oh, no way. So this is one very important topic. So I think that like this initiative, we can really change all these bad things we have in society.
Great, thank you. Frank?
Yeah, so I have what I call I hate Frank days. And when I have my I hate Frank days, I feel very pessimistic. And I think of, you know, like somebody asked the question about, you said about Islamic migration here. And it does remind me sometimes of the Roman Empire, when it kind of, they lost confidence and it was, you know, destroyed from within. So that's my I hate Frank days, and I worry a lot. But it gets me up in the morning and it gets me to do things. But then I also have my good days, and on a good day, I feel quite optimistic that it is possible. And I am a big believer in free will, even though it's not completely free, but it's sufficiently there for us to change the world that we are in, influence at the very least the world we are in. And I think that we can make a very big difference. I think there's more and more people who are finding their voice. I think that's the great thing about what's happening in Europe at the moment. A lot of people who were too scared to basically say that the emperor has got no clothes are now finally saying that. And that's a really good thing. But the thing that we have to remember is that people on our side have for a long, long time fell asleep. I mean, conservatives did not understand that a culture war was being fought against them. They were essentially asleep, and the culture war, when it began, was one-sided. Nobody was fighting back. And it's only that, and we've lost at least 4 generations of young people to the other side because we weren't doing what we should have been doing. But now I think the situation is changing, and I think the key thing for us is to get out of our stupor and begin to challenge these things publicly. So the point that Ladislav was making about the citizens' initiative is really important, but we have to have initiatives in all domains of our life, in culture, the media, politically, where we basically, in a sense, in a confident kind of a way, project an alternative and expose all the things that are being hidden from the public, so that ordinary people in Europe can see for themselves all the damage that's being done, and can also at the same time gain the confidence to fight back against it. So our job, as I see it, is to give a voice, through our own voice, to the ability of other people to express their desires, for a better life. And I think that's, we should be optimistic and not just simply criticize and talk about how bad things are, but occasionally find the light, where the light gets in, as Leonard Cohen said, I forget the expression, get that kind of little light and open that sort of door a little bit more, so that there's more and more light coming through that shines the way forward.
Thank you. Before we applaud you, Frank and Ladislav, if Tony would like to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Agnieszka. Just want to talk to you very briefly, picking up on something Frank said. I've experienced too much cultural cooling in my life, so I don't want to hold you back from some cultural warming that I'm going to invite you to next door shortly. Not necessarily with me, don't get worried, but definitely we want to have some cultural warming in amongst us. But based on a couple of things that Frank was just saying now, I want to just put a little practical aspect to that, because one of the words I wrote down during the sessions today in capital letters, in fact, the only word I wrote down in capital letters was bond, or bonds, and it's a word that came up quite a lot. And we started our series of MCC Brussels events after the summer back in September with one on the role of museums, and I'm not going to go through them all, but we had a lot of really important debates and discussions. And as I look around the room, there's some people I haven't met before. I'm very pleased to have some people coming to see us for the first time, but I'm also looking at people that I have formed a genuine bond with over this period of time. Because as Frank has said, we are in this together, and it is the fight of our lives, and we've got to make it real, okay? So one thing that you can do that will be kind of fun and easy to make it real is come to our Christmas party on Tuesday. But more importantly, if you know somebody open-minded who wants to be part of a network of people who are up for challenging things, up for doing things differently, then bring them along, okay? Secondly, as we gear up for, we want a lot more people to be making these points and arguing these points out, and that's where you come in, that you can find those like-minded people, invite those people along, get them to be brave. At the end of the last conference we had here at ACE, Frank used a very key word about courage, the importance of courage, and the courage that we will need to make a difference, to change things. So we want you to invite people along who've got the courage to be part of something. And so on the 10th of January, we have our first event back in the new year. Sylvie Perez written a fantastic book on woke culture and challenging woke culture. So please do put that in your diary, and do make a note to yourself to bring 1 or 2 people with you to our first event. Okay,
thank you, Tony, and
thank
now
you very much.
Big thank you to Ladislav and Frank, especially to Frank. And please join us for a drink and some nibbles, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Oh, how do I get this?